Isotonic contractions. This contraction causes a muscle to change length as it contracts. There are two types of isotonic contractions. Concentric. This contraction causes the muscle to change length as it contracts. This is the most common contraction and is used frequently in sporting activities. A sporting example of this contraction is a bicep curl. When bringing the weight up, the bicep brachii contracts, making the muscle shorten. Eccentric. This contraction is the opposite of concentric and occurs when the muscle lengthens as it contracts. A sporting example of this contraction is a bicep curl. When bringing the weight down, the bicep brachii contracts, making the muscle lengthen. Isometric contractions. This contraction occurs when there is no change in length of the contracting muscle. This happens when carrying an object in front of you and the weight of the object is pulling your arms down as your muscles are contracting to hold the object at the same level. A sporting example of this is when you grip a tennis racket. There is no movement in the joints of the hand, but the muscles are contracting to give enough force to keep a steady hold of the racket. Isokinetic contractions. This contraction is similar to isotonic in that the muscle changes length during the contraction, but a bit different in that the isokinetic contraction produces movement at a constant speed. A sporting example of using isokinetic contraction is breaststroke in swimming, as the water provides a constant, even resistance to the movement of adduction. Proprioceptors are also called stretch receptors. These receptors are found in joints, muscles, ligaments and tendons, and the inner ear. The muscle spindles of the arms and legs and the Golgi tendon organ, found at the meeting point between muscle and tendon, are examples of proprioceptors. Their function is to send the brain messages about the body's position. The inner ear is a proprioceptor, helping the orientation and the balance of the body. In this 100-meter hurdles race, proprioception is being used. The quadriceps and the hamstrings in the runner's legs are contracting when jumping over the hurdles. The body's sense of ability and balance are crucial to this movement as they are running at a constant speed, jumping over the hurdles. They are doing this without looking at the body parts at all, which is essential in this sport. Flexion is a bending movement, usually along the sagittal plane, that decreases the angle of the joints and brings articulating bones closer together. Extension is the reverse of flexion and occurs at the same joints. It involves movements along the sagittal plane that increases the angle between the articulating bones and typically straightens a flexed limb or body part. A sporting example of this is a throw-in in football. When bringing the arms back, the angle of the joint has decreased, giving us power and accuracy to throw the ball to a teammate. When releasing the ball, the angle of the joint in the arms increases, causing the arms to straighten. Excessive extension, such as extending the patella beyond its anatomical position, is called hyperextension or superextension. The example I have here is that the player fell funny on his leg, causing his knee to go backwards and is out of his range of motion. Abduction is movement of a limb away from the midline or median plane of the body along the frontal plane. A sporting example of abduction is a goalkeeper saving football, as the arm is being raised laterally and is moving away from the body, making sure the goalkeeper gets to the ball. Adduction is the opposite of abduction, so it is the movement of the limb towards the body midline. Using resistant bands is a type of adduction, as the resistance is pulling the leg back towards the body. Circumduction is moving a limb extending from the joint at which the movement is controlled. True circumduction allows 360 degrees of movement. A spawn example of circumduction is a goalkeeper throwing football, as the ball and socket joint in the player's shoulder is rotating 360 degrees, making him throw the ball to a team player. Rotation is the turning of a bone around its own long axis. It is the only movement allowed between the first two cervical vertebrae and is common in the neck. A spawn example of rotation is going up for a header in football, as the player has to rotate the neck to generate power to direct the ball with the head towards the goal. Supination refers to the movement of the radius around the ulna, rotating the forearm laterally so the palm faces anteriorly or superiorly is supination. A sporting example of this is throwing a frisbee. When throwing the frisbee, the forearm rotates, causing the palm of your hand to face down. In pronation, the forearm rotates medially and the palm faces posteriorly or inferiorly. Pronation moves the distal end of the radius across the ulna so that the two bones form an X. A sporting example of this is playing a spin shot in tennis. When playing this shot, you have your palm faced up, and when connecting with the ball, the palm will face down. The up and down movements of the foot at the ankle are given more specific names. Lifting the foot so that its superior surface approaches the shin is dorsiflexion, whereas depressing the foot, pointing the toes, is plantar flexion. A sporting example of dorsiflexion is controlling the ball in football. You have to adjust your positioning of your foot to make sure you control the ball without it leaving your body. A spawn example of plantar flexion is shooting with the laces in football. Pointing your toes down and shooting with the laces will generate power and accuracy on your shots. Inversion is a movement in which the plantar surface of the foot rotates towards the midline of the body. A spawn example of inversion is shooting with the outside of the boot in football. This technique is pretty hard to pick up at first as you have less power and accuracy, but you can play more advanced passes with the outside of the foot and do flick-ons. Eversion is a movement in which the plantar surface of the foot rotates away from the midline of the body. A spawn example of eversion is an inside pass in football. You turn your foot towards and connect with the middle of the ball, using the power from your legs and hips to create a pass. Protraction is a movement of a body part in the anterior direction, i.e. being drawn forwards, and retraction is the opposite of protraction, with a body part in the posterior direction, i.e. being drawn backwards. A spawn example of this is rowing. The rowers use oars or blades to propel the boat, generating power from the shoulders to get in front of their opponents. Elevation is the upward movement of structures of the body, and depression is the downward movement of the structures of the body. Depression of the shoulder joint lowers the corresponding arm vertically downwards. A sporting example of this is when you shrug your shoulders as the scapula is elevated, and when bringing the weight down, the scapula is alternately elevated and depressed. Lateral flexion is the movement of the head laterally away from the midline of the body. A sporting example of this is dodging a punch in boxing. And receiving a punch, your head will move laterally away from the body so that you don't get hit.
Size of the stimulus. This talks about the number of motor units that are required depending on the size of the stimulus. An example would be picking up and throwing a dart. This would be much easier than performing a maximum weight. There would obviously be more motor units needed to complete a weight lift, which is many more kilograms, as of the dart would usually be around 26 to 28 grams. The number of motor units. Motor units are clusters of fibres which are activated only when needed by the nervous system. The fibres don't partial contract, and the nervous system activates only the fibres that are needed to complete the movement. This therefore means that the larger amounts of motor units equals the greater tension the muscle can exert. Force velocity. There is a relationship between muscle force and contraction velocity. In concentric contractions, where contraction velocity is high, the muscle force must be low. Where muscle force is high, the contraction velocity must be low. For eccentric contractions, where contraction velocity is high, the muscle force can be high. Where muscle force is low, contraction velocity must be low. Length tension. As the muscle experiences extreme shortening or lengthening, the amount of muscle can exert is steeply decreased due to a bunching of muscle fibres, which is shortening phase, or because of a reduced number of cross bridging, which is extreme lengthening. Delayed onset muscle soreness is an experience of soreness which occurs several hours after finishing exercise and can last up to 4 days. It is initially associated with muscle fatigue, and DOMS is at its highest when activities have involved eccentric contractions, which is when the muscle elongates when tensing. Therefore, the opposite, both concentric and isometric, usually produce less soreness. The nervous system is a complex network of nerves and cells that carry messages to and from the brain and the spinal cord to the needed parts of the body. The afferent division transmits impulses from peripheral organs to the CNS. The efferent division transmits signals from the CNS to the peripheral organs to cause and effect or action. There is then a trigger whereby the stimulation of the nervous system whereby an action potential is sent through the nerve. It then reaches the muscle cell via the neuromuscular junction. When the stimulates the junction, the chemical message creates, which is a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, and that reacts with the receptors on the outside of the muscle fiber starting the reaction. Once this has happened, the channels open, and that cellular magnets into the cytoplasm, which then sends another message, initiating the release of stored calcium ions, which diffuse into the muscle fibers, changing the state of the muscle fibers that lead into the contraction. Once the impulse of the muscle fibers stop, the chemical reaction stops, and there is a reversal of chemical reactions called a relaxation phase. In the sliding filament theory, there are 4 main stages. Number 1, muscle activation. The motor nerve stimulates an action potential to pass down and meet the neuromuscular junction. This is where the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium in the muscle cell. Number 2, muscle contraction. Calcium and troponin bind to allow actin and myosin to bind also, and the latter two create cross bridges and contract using ATP, the fuel needed to complete activities. Number 3, recharge. Actin and myosin continue to keep a strong binding state due to the remanufacturing of ATP. Number 4, relaxation. This is when the stimulation of the nerves stops and calcium is pumped back, breaking the myosin and actin bond.